um, in the modern age. My name is Judah McNeil, and I'm sitting here with Ford Suze, and we're going to talk about Ender's Game. An interesting, probably for me, one of the most influential, one of my favorite sci-fi series books. Ender's Game itself, the best book I've ever read as far as sci-fi goes. And it's written by Orson Scott Card. Orson Scott Card. He's a renowned what do you call it? His religion is
Mormon.
Sorry. Kept wanting to say LGBT, but that's not.
Oh, you're probably thinking of the other one. What is the other one called? The
Latter-day Saints.
LDS. Yeah. LDS. That's what it is. Yeah.
LDS.
That's Mormons. Yeah. LDS.
So he did. So I did see. I was able to review the book on YouTube, and I guess it was posted by activists against Orson Scott Card because of his comments disparaging, or in their eyes disparaging, the LGBT community. So I thank them for that, because I appreciated being able to listen to it as like an audio book. I read it, I don't know, 20 years ago, I think. No, 10 years ago.
Yeah, but 10 for me too.
Yeah. So I have very little bad to say about this book. Would you? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't have anything bad to say about it. I think it's. I mean, it's actually pretty deep book. You know, it's a very exciting book. It's a page turner. It would make a great movie if they know how to make a movie out of it. But you know, as the movie didn't hold up to it, as is usually the case. So yeah, I don't have anything bad to say about it. I think it has some interesting ideas, and like the best science fiction, it paints this picture of the future that it turns out to be prophetic. I mean, there's certain things in there that he was seeing it happen before it was really happening. You know, maybe he was observing some things that were going on and with computers, but I mean, the stuff about the basically blogs that the brother sister have that changed the world. You know, that bloggers would have that big of an impact. I mean, that's pretty prophetic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say the whole. Well, I'm trying to remember now. It's interesting. In the later books, he talks a lot about the internet. And he was writing that. So he originally wrote this story back in the 70s.
Okay. So it's that old, yeah.
Well, he wrote this story. It was like as a short story back in the 70s. And then it got published as a book. He expanded it because he won some kind of prize for this. He published it in like a magazine or something. And he got noticed because of it. And then he expanded into a book in the early 80s, I think.
Okay.
But just a really interesting guy. Apparently, he was Card was his brother was in the military back then, and he was reading, pretty heavy, some of these older sci-fi books. I'm trying to remember who he was reading, but so he ended up thinking about what would it be like to train in space. And then he couldn't really think of how to make it interesting until he thought of, well, what if it was children? You know, like how better to, because he was thinking, because he was one of the first to ever explore the idea of maneuver. What is it? I think is maneuver strategy.
Okay.
So I think there's a book called The Art of Strategy or something like that. And I mean, it was groundbreaking stuff when he first started, and still is. But just reading it and thinking about all this strategy.
Right. And the mechanics of the anti-grav and how things to think outside of the box and come up with new strategies. Yeah. Yeah, it reminds me like one of my favorite fantasy writers is Brandon Sanderson, and in his books, usually the superpowers that some character has are tied to some skill that they have to learn. So it's not just, they don't just fly. They basically manipulate their relationship to gravity, and it takes conscious effort. And like when they first do it, they don't even realize it. Think of it as flying, and so it creates, it would be very cinematic to actually show this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But it creates a tension there that just is often lost from, our post superpower saturated, things. And so, yeah, like you said, when he presents these arenas, where Ender is kind of breaking the mold and thinking outside of the box and thinking laterally instead of vertically, or vertically instead of laterally, it adds this other element. It's not just like, oh, he's good because he always had it in him. He's good because he has superior strategy. And you get to see that mechanically work out really well in the story, as opposed to just, I think sometimes it's almost just like a cheat. Like the good guy wins because he's the good guy. But yeah, this is real methodical. I mean, you could say procedural in the way that it develops his battle strategy and the way that he makes his decisions as a fighter or as a planner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and for anybody who hasn't read the book, it's about a young boy who is actually allowed. It's in a sort of dystopian future in which only people are only allowed to have up to 2 kids, and he is allowed to be born as a third. They call them thirds. And when he's 6 years old, he's allowed to be born because they're looking for a child to become the general of the army against the buggers. The buggers are, and I think they call them the Formics in the movie. They are these bug-like aliens who have attacked the world. And instead of having like a World War I and World War II, in the future they have the Bugger War I and the Bugger War II, in which the buggers try to invade in the first war, and then they were destroyed, or a second invasion was destroyed in the second war. And so now they are trying to take it to the buggers. And so we watch him go through military school with other children. His brother is a sort of a sadistic, he was originally looked at to be the general, but he's too sadistic. And his older sister, who he loves very much, Valentine, is very loving, but she's too empathetic, and he is a mixture of both. And of course, Ender's not sadistic. I think one of the most beautiful themes of the book is looking at innocence versus power. How do you remain innocent when you and yet still use power, still influence?
Right.
And I think maneuver is the word that comes to my mind, instead of, like, I often use the word manipulate, right? Like,
right.
But that has such a bad connotations. I think the word maneuver explains better how to use power,
right,
without being a tyrant, without being a sadistic person.
Yeah, because Ender's brother is definitely a manipulator, and Ender, you're right, he's a maneuverer. He's finding ways to work around situations. Maybe I feel like he'd be one of those people in war who tries to kill the least amount of people,
Yeah.
to try to end the battle with the least amount of casualties on either side, not just on his side. He's actually trying to think of it methodically. How can we, solve this problem with the least amount of casualty?
Right. He's a young boy. He's 6 years old, thrown into the situation where the powers that be, a bunch of old men basically, are
right.
In the movie they use a woman, but they're trying to push him as far as they can because they believe in him and he's their last hope. And so he's put into these situations that all he's trying to do, what he comes back to is, I'm just trying to survive. And it's interesting to me to this idea of, okay, well, not just survive, but he said he beat this one boy who tried to attack him not viciously, but thoroughly. He uses they say like when they talk about Ender, they say he's not vicious, he's thorough. He beat him extra violently so that he would not have to, he said, so that he wouldn't have to be in any more fights, so that people would be, he didn't want to get in these fights. And so he just he took the opportunity to shut him down by being violent. And this idea of violence, the whole book is very violent,
right?
But
definitely.
It deals with violence in a way, going back to the idea of being put in position where you have to survive. So Orson Scott Card, as a Mormon, dealing with the idea of violence, in light of a peaceful religion, because Ender he's a peaceful guy. He really is.
Right.
And we see that in the later books, and at the end of the book. But what was your takeaway as far as violence and how we partake in violence as peaceful, people?
Yeah, I think, Ender is kind of the model, that because he doesn't have the whole story, and so he's doing the best he can with the information that's been given to him. And I think that that's kind of the role of a soldier. Again, like whatever war you go into, you don't actually know if you're on the right side or not.
Mm-hmm.
You think you are, you assume you are, but so the best strategy you can do really is to try to mitigate damage, try to do as little harm as possible. But the job of war is to kill. So, an idealist does not really stop wars. The war marches on, whether there's a picketer on the side or not. If Ender had turned into a pacifist, that wouldn't have stopped the war. So
interesting. That's a huge statement.
Of course, the question is, well, I mean, given the ending, though, that is kind of an interesting thought to kind of take further. It might actually, what would have happened? That's an interesting thought experiment. What would have happened if Ender had been a pacifist? I think in the end they probably would have just resorted to calling on his brother, because they would have to be so ruthless. So Hawthorne, I'm sorry, not Hawthorne. What's it? Hemingway. Hemingway wrote this book about war, and he said basically, it would be, in a perfect world, there would be no war. But when it comes to war, he wrote this book, just basic collection of stories, of retellings, of journalistic or history about war through the ages. And in his prologue, he was talking about how, even back then, there's this kind of naive belief that we can be without war. And, you want that to be the case, but it's the job of the soldier to try to finish it as quickly as possible, losing as little life as possible. Mm-hmm. And it's a terrible business, but it is a business, So I think, the way he handles himself in a lot of the training exercises is a good example of that, just that maneuvering. I think, and then not only that, but when he comes to fuller understanding what's actually going on, his response to that, rather than doubling down and saying, trying to reinterpret the universe to align with what he did, he takes responsibility for what he did, realizes that it wasn't the right call, that the powers that be were mistaken themselves. They misunderstood what was going on. Which, it's pretty typical for existing systems. When cultural lag is in effect, when there's a society that's under attack, they get defensive, and rationality tends to go out the window. So, the ability to empathize, to cross-culturally communicate, those things are not real prized possessions. They're not really high on the list when survival it seems to be on the line. But I think we do jump to the survival being on the line thing probably too quickly in a lot of cases.
That was a great conversation between him and the general that's put over him. I think what was his name? Frag or something like that. General. Anyways, where he's asking about the bugger war, and he asked him, "Why do you think we're in this war?" And he says, basically, Ender interprets it to say, "So we're at war because we can't communicate." And he says, basically, yes. And I thought that was very interesting. The idea, because the buggers are completely psychic, they can't talk through machine or mouth, and so the whole war was over this inability to communicate.
Yeah, that's a fascinating commentary, and I feel like that the more that I engage with India, for instance, or Indians in particular, from India, the more I just realize how difficult it is just for human beings who have very different histories, very different arrays of cultures, not just culture or cultures, but arrays of cultures that kind of communicate within their own ecosystem. We get these two ecosystems together. They have a very hard time. We have a very hard time communicating. And so war, whether it be ideological or literal, physical, seems to be the first recourse for human nature. It's just that fear. Fear drives you to that next level because you just don't know what's in the other person's mind.
Yeah.
And so I feel like so much competition in the world stems from that. Definitely, that's a great way of putting it.
Competition. Yeah, and so it was hard for me to really come down on a side, even at the end of the book, because of the lack of communication. When you add when two entities can't communicate, and you add into the mix technology and weaponry, it's like you have to have war. Either you have war or you have genocide, because when you see these huge weapons coming towards you, even if they mean peace, you can't know. He said we couldn't know for sure if they did, and in the end it was us or them. And I thought that was interesting. Although today, what does that mean for like cultures in which we can communicate? It's not like that, in which where it's psychic versus verbal. What do we do? Because war comes from, like you said, fear, but real fear, right? Like, I need this to survive. You want this, and if you can't communicate, you can't barter. How do we communicate in this limited cross-culture environment that we find ourselves globally?
It does get convoluted by the fact that there are people who want power, and so one of the easiest tool to get power is to play off people's fear. So xenophobia is a very healthy motivator for servile people. So if you can, and this happens all over the world. There are people that think it's Donald Trump or Adolf Hitler invented pitting people against each other. That's just, it happens everywhere in every society that's ever been. In India, like they call it communalism. When one politician starts playing off the sentiments of another. Right now, there's a rather militant arm of one political side, which is normally a peaceful side, calling for the beheading of an actress because he doesn't like the portrayal of this one character that may not even be literally historical. And to even say that right now, it's almost if I drew a cartoon of Muhammad. Like, it's that big of a deal. And this historical character is like no one had even heard of 5 years ago. So it's just, And there are some who debated if she was even historical. It's just like, why someone's actually, you know, whether or not rhetorically calling for the beheading of the woman that played this one, like, really? But power is just very easy to is a very easy motivator to get people to be pitted against each other. And we see that in the West, like the KKK, the white supremacist movements, anti-Jewish movements, anti-black, anti-immigrant. There's this, and that doesn't just have one flavor. I mean, we're seeing it right now in terms of anti-Islamic immigration, but I mean that was happening in New York with different ethnicities. The Jews, the Irish, the Italians against each other. So I feel like I mean, you can think about Northern Ireland, you can think about Catholics and Protestants. Like there's this tendency a lot of times. One of the examples from India that I think of is Al Jinnah. He was when the partition of India and Pakistan, and Al Jinnah was the one who represented the Islamic side and wanted to have this sovereign Islamic state. And that's where Pakistan came from. And so that's a very convoluted thing. And so I may kind of gloss over this in a very, short little thing here. But the idea being that when I've read about that guy, I've not been impressed at all because he did not seem like a teetotaling, card-carrying Muslim. He was a Muslim by identity, but he wasn't a Muslim by practice. And so when I see people do that, when I see Christians who are, I mean, that happens in the Christian right all the time. The Christian right, and the guy's divorced 3 women. Like, oh yeah, you really represent Christians, don't you, dude? That kind of thing is despicable to me. It's the heights of his hypocrisy that you're going to use a religious voting block, just for the block, just for the political power. So war is an easy way to amass power. So some people have a career ambition, and they see this. It's just almost like a turnkey operation. You've got this whole block that's going to support you if you can convince them that these rivals or these aliens or these other cultures are bad. So I think, the more that we think as blocks of people, the more that we think as races, ethnicities, linguistic blocks, or nationalities, or religions, the more that we think about all those things as our fundamental identity, then the easier it is to pit each other against each other. And and almost everyone has a different thing at their core, their core value. And so that makes it even more complicated because someone has religion as their core value, someone has nationality as their core value, someone has economics as their core value. And so it gets to be pretty difficult pretty quickly to figure out what a person's game is. And so people can play that really easily. And so, I think that's one of the hard things. Like maybe we are human beings and we speak similar languages and we can find ways to translate or communicate. But we have these kind of tricksters in the middle of us that are trying to pit us against each other. And they're doing it for their own ends.
I agree completely. And even taking it from a global perspective, which I think is really interesting. I'd like to get more into that in one of these discussions, but maybe for the sake of time, taking it down to more of a personal level, there's a conversation that Ender has with his sister Valentine about, oh, you're just trying to manipulate me. You're just, everybody wants to have power, using their power against me. And she says, instead of saying no, she says, we're human. And welcome. I think she says, "Welcome to the human race." That's what it means. That's I don't think she said that's what it means to be human, but that's a part of being human, is deciding how to use the power that we've been given.
Right.
And so when it comes to maneuvering and game, like you're saying, playing games, and one thing that came to my mind real quickly is, as men, me and you, even as adults. But I think particularly as men, because Ender's Game is about boys, right? When it comes to boys, when have we had? I feel like in our modern day culture, in today's culture, where do we have the ability to maneuver? Where are we allowed? I think that's when I feel that I'm most useful is when I'm maneuvering, but I don't often feel useful because we don't have a lot of arenas to maneuver,
Right.
to execute, our influence on a
Yeah.
situation.
The only two places we have, or well, only three places we have are the military, sports, and crime. So, like,
Mm.
those are the only three places where males, I mean, you can say entrepreneurial. I mean, I guess you say the entrepreneurial world as well. So, I mean, four places. So, military, sports, crime, either side of the crime
Mhm.
game, or the entrepreneurial world. And so I think most men probably end up going into the business world, but the business world has become very political, and I would not say that it's so easy to apply like maneuvering strategies to a lot of what has become business, because you have to think, you have to play 5D chess all the time,
Yeah.
because you're not just you're thinking about legal, you're thinking about accounting, you're thinking about politics, um, you're thinking about speech, so there's just so many things that is kind of, whereas in military, that's a different kind of maneuvering, I feel like. And military crime and sports, they're different kinds of maneuverings. You know what the general rules are. There are tactics, there are goals, there are objectives to be won, right? um
That's the key there. Tactics and goals. Uh, I've had many bosses over me in my life, and what I found is a astonishing lack of tactics and goals.
yeah,
Where you,
absolutely.
where you have people that are just meeting benchmarks, surviving, basically just uh, collecting a paycheck and doing, like not playing
Mhm.
chess, just playing checkers, just moving your guys ahead
Yeah, it's not
because
even checkers. It's snakes and ladders. I mean, I would say
mm,
it's just this game of chance. Candyland. It's Candyland, snakes and ladders, and that's true. And all my experiences with NGOs, with the church, with businesses, it's the same with the education system.
yeah, for sure.
It's just moving numbers around. Like, it's not actually math. It's manipulative statistics. It's just moving things around to make it look like things are happening.
Yeah.
So it's not maneuvering. It's manipulation.
Well, and I think it's either manipulation or the fear of manipulation, right? Like
Yeah.
I feel like in at least in the I think in the people that surround me in my sphere of influence, there is a lot of like, well, we don't want to
Right. That's true.
get
It's
into manipulation. Whereas I think there needs to be more of a place, especially for young men, and I think our age, where we are able to use our God-given intelligence. It takes
Mhm.
intelligence to maneuver.
Right.
And I feel my brain atrophying in this society where we're just called to go and do this, put this here, and
Yep.
and come home and fold clothes or wash dishes, instead of thinking transcendently, thinking in the meta about how to accomplish
Right.
hard things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the lack of risk, the lack of challenge, and that's why I think, you know, there's whole sections of male society that just never ever reach that, if they don't go to the military,
Yeah.
or into crime, like or sports to some degree too, like those three areas, because you're like the corporate world, the business world, it's almost like the game is already set. People have decided and no, we're not going to let you move, and so you have to really go to the boundaries, so which requires a ton of intelligence, or just a maverick spirit, which is just which is daunting. And that's the thing about the military. It's not about maverick spirit. It's about you need mentors. You need people who are gonna tell you, yeah, you can walk that 100-mile march, and you're gonna survive. Because
Yeah.
if you get 20 miles into it, you're like, oh, forget this is impossible, because
Yeah.
it's you need somebody to bring you that extra mile. And so Ender's able to get there because of a structure of challenge and risk, and and yeah, pushing forward.
and
So
and older mentors above him pushing him and
Right.
putting him in situations and believing in him, really.
Right.
Both of us, so both of us have kids. What, real quick, what are your thoughts on sports?
Um, yeah, I don't know. I think sports are in their present form are pretty outmoded. I think that they've been supplanted by video games. You know, video games are just so much more complex, and even though they're not realistic in a physical way, that will change soon with virtual reality. They're much more realistic in a tactical way. You know, I mean, think about all major sports that we play. They're, you know, bat and ball games or ball and boundary games, and they're avoiding what we're really talking about. We're talking about war here. Okay. Like, let's quit acting like it's anything else. Like football, I think is maybe one of the most football and rugby are maybe the closest approximations because there's actually bodily contact. But, you know, MMA is probably as close as you're going to get. Like, so what we really need is like some sort of like Dota 2 or StarCraft or League of Legends inspired version of MMA where you have two teams of, you know, 5 that, you know, beat each other up, and
Let me tell
in
you,
a tactical way.
I think that is the future of video games is what is the word you always use? Adding more risk, not risk, where you have something to lose. So
Stakes.
Yes, yeah. Adding stakes to a game like Dota. And I think eventually leading to, I think like you were saying, Ender's Game being prophetic. I was talking to a guy who works with the Bureau of National Security, and he was talking about like they were, I don't know, he works on weapons. And I asked him, I said, look, I think the future is really robots fighting and people with, you know, video game controllers behind them. And he said, absolutely. He said, we're doing that now more than ever. He said, with the prevalence of drones now and the ability to target, you know, like pinpoint targets.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, you know, and it needs to be an equitable fight. And so what we're going to have eventually is conflict resolution. And then instead of dealing with lawyers, you know, who become our battlers, we actually have people either, it could be one of two ways. It could be like you know, Dota or League of Legends, where you say you get your best 5 players and we get our best 5 players. And, you know, in order to do that, it needs to be like the blockchain. It needs to be like Bitcoin. It needs to be this comprehensively, uniformly accountable ledger, that there's no arbitrating committee. Like the math is doing the arbitration. There is no dispute. Like, and so the technology is not quite there for video games yet, because, you know, even in these Dota or League tournaments, there's usually a pause. There's usually some malfunction. You know, like you can't have malfunctions or pauses when, you know, $1 million is on the line or something like that. Like, oh,
well, often the pauses are people giving up, right? Not the stakes aren't high enough. They just give up, and you have lopsided.
That does happen, but you know, I mean, they're working some of those kinks out now. But I do honestly think that could be a way. You know, it could be, instead of like we're going to kill human beings, we're going to kill pixels on a screen, and that's going to be how you bring your best, we bring our best. I mean, and basically, and that's what they call them the telecom wars. You know, in Korea, you've got SK Telecom against this other telecom, and they've picked their best 5 Korean players against the best, and they end up winning the world every time. And so what it is basically, it would be like if Comcast and Netflix, rather than bringing the government in to do this stupid net neutrality thing, like, no, y'all solve this dispute yourselves. Netflix, you get your best 5 players. Comcast, you get your best 5 players, and the loser has to give in, you know, for a period of time. Like, as opposed to having some independent arbitration that doesn't understand how the internet works, comes in and regulate the internet for everyone, making it a law that applies to everyone, as opposed to just to you 2 people. You know, this attitude of just applying one specific case to an entire, you know, 400 million people, that's absurd. And that's how, and then, you know, invariably when these decisions come, that's when the writers come in, you know, like these little footnotes that nobody can interpret, that give one person this ridiculous amount of power. But, oh, it's all about neutrality, you know, like that kind of stuff just can't work anymore. We need independent arbitration where the state and the courts and lawyers aren't the ones deciding it. And so I think war in a virtual way could be a way to do that, because sometimes people are just not going to agree. And sometimes they're both wrong, or sometimes it's, 45-55. And how are you going to figure out what that 5%? Well, computers will be able to figure that out better. And in the meantime, who's willing to fight harder for it?
Well, but not just who's able to fight harder for it. The problem I have is that puts me in a disposition. I don't have any resources. I can't put me up against Google.
Well, but that's the way it is now, though. I mean, Google is the tyrant. I mean, that's what drives me crazy about this Netflix. I mean, the net neutrality thing. It's like, I have no recourse. I've been on YouTube for a better part of 10 years. I have no recourse against Google. They say, oh, this is not ad friendly. I can't. There's nobody going to listen to me. What am I going to do? Petition them? And if they and people have used my content before. If I sued them, what? Do I have the money to sue them? No. And if I did sue them, would I win in court? No. Would they pay me a settlement? No. So this is an imbalanced tort system. It's an imbalanced justice system. So when people talk about this whole neutrality thing, it's not neutral to begin with. Google has gotten to this point where they've become arbiters of the internet. They're no longer a search engine. They're editors. They're the news corporation of the internet that says, oh, you're looking for that? Oh, well, we invest in this product. Here it is. They're doing that. Like they promised 20 years ago that they wouldn't be evil. They're doing that now.
Yeah.
So we need, and that's why I mean, we need some sort of independent ways where, that the bar to getting there, like you think about the bar to entry for war. Well, war doesn't care.
Yeah, that's true.
That's why America was able to beat Britain, because war doesn't care that Britain marches in this nice little pretty line. Guerrilla warfare will work. There are other ways of winning.
That was one of the major themes. That was the theme of his maneuvering. The reason Ender was so powerful was because he understood that the key to winning was doing the unexpected. War doesn't care, so do whatever it takes. That doesn't mean being as violent as you can. That just means being violent. It means do whatever it takes and think about it outside of the box. Don't think about it in terms of two armies meeting each other, but think about it in terms of strategy and what do they expect? How can I subvert that?
Right. And, you could do Sun Tzu's The Art of War. I mean, you read that and you're just like, I mean, it's still mind boggling and revelatory all these years later. And again, from the other side of the planet, like this war is real. Like you can't pretend that it doesn't exist, and it's just like math is real. You can't pretend that it doesn't exist. And so this is why you need these independent, but we want to find a way. And that's one of the purposes of technology. You want to find a way to mitigate the damage, find a way rather than to, I think the atomic weapon, the evolution of nuclear warfare got to the point where now we just don't want to go there. We don't want to go to total war, because if it comes to total war, the whole world is going to be destroyed. So almost everybody, I mean, so far, there was all these doomsday scenarios. Here we are. We're 70 years into this and we haven't obliterated the planet yet. It's because we finally reached the God particle and we're like, we do not want to crack this thing open. In a total war scenario. So I think.
Well, let me ask you a question about net neutrality, because I know I've seen some things you said about that, and I've seen on both sides. I'm really not sure how to think of it, but I do want to know if, say, net neutrality is overturned. Right? What does that mean for us? How do we have better access?
It's not going to affect anybody. It's not going to change anything. In 2015, we didn't have net neutrality the way that they're defining it. This is just a political framing device. FCC passed this thing in 2015 that didn't exist for 15 years before that. And everyone is saying like, oh man, we're going to go back to the dark age. What dark ages? I'm sorry. I don't remember what was happening 3 years ago. It's after that was passed. I can think of bad things have happened after it passed. How about Adpocalypse on YouTube? I can think about that. I can think about the fact that it's John Oliver and Keith Olbermann and Seth Meyers every day on YouTube trending, even though they're not getting the most views. I can think about that.
Yeah.
That happened after net neutrality. It didn't happen before it.
Yeah.
So it's not net neutrality, because that's not neutral. Well, just the other day, and I know these are two different conversations, but they are using that in a political framing device to talk about Comcast as if Comcast is the end of the world. Comcast is not going to last another 10 years because they don't respect Bitcoin. Yeah. They don't understand how the world of math works anymore. They're a giant corporation. They're slow. They're stodgy. They will be destroyed. This is not Ma Bell from 100 years ago. This isn't the Rockefellers. Okay. You know, trying to use Title II documentation, this laws from 100 years ago to try to regulate trusts in 2017 is so hilarious to me.
Yeah.
And acting like, Comcast is the most powerful person in America. That's so stupid. On the other side of Comcast, you have Google, Facebook, Twitter.
Yeah.
The three of them together are more powerful than Comcast. Are you kidding me right now?
Well, and it goes back
having this conversation.
It goes back to what you're saying about using fear as power, as a mechanism towards power. People fear, but also disgust. People hate Comcast. So
yeah, well, but here's the thing, Comcast, and this is the part that frustrates me so much. I don't have Comcast. Why are they acting like it's the only thing? Yeah. And by using old documentation from 100 years ago, where they were public utilities that were natural corporations. That the government mandated they exist, mandated monopolies, natural monopolies. Comcast is not a natural monopoly. It has competition in the market. If you can only get access to Comcast in your place, you got a couple options. Yeah. Maybe you can learn to set up your own network.
Yeah.
It's not like 200 years ago here, people.
Yeah.
Their motherboard, Vice just did is doing a report about that. These guys going into Detroit and setting up internet connections for people because they don't get good ones. Take some initiative here. This is not, it's like, this is the country of Thoreau. This is the country of resistance. This is the country of overthrowing a more powerful enemy. Yes. Like, quit acting like we are beholden to the government to come in and intervene and save our. I'm not going to be able to get my Netflix for, if you pass this law, I'm going to have to pay $2 a month extra for Netflix. That's not what net neutrality should be about.
Yeah,
that is absurd. Now, on the other hand, the way Google is violating net neutrality by insider trading.
Yeah,
insider trading in front of everyone. Having vested interests. They say creator on the rise. They just did this the other day. I saw this. Creator on the rise, and they bring in now this nerd. Now this is a corporate media outlet, and they have this smaller channel, has about the same amount of subscribers as me.
Yeah,
but they put that as creator on the rise. I've never been creator on the rise.
Well, yeah,
and they're not a creator. That's a corporation.
Yeah,
that's not net neutrality. Yeah. So all these people saying this, they're benefiting from that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
John Oliver, as if he doesn't benefit from lack of net neutrality. Right, it's real neutral for him. Yeah. Subsidized by HBO.
Well, I think we should take hope because, first of all, we've seen that there is hope. There are people that it takes it too far, right? These guys take it too far, and they blow it up, and they don't realize that there's this whole group of people that are in charge that don't realize that as Americans and just as free people, we want to kind of do things our own way, and we saw that in the election, and I think we're going to continue to see that.
Yeah, I think so too. Especially with, cryptocurrencies. I think honestly that'll be kind of one of the balancing acts to all the corruption that we saw in 2008. Again, this is what frustrates me so much. It's like it's just like we have short-term memory loss. Like, oh, okay, so this bad thing happened mainly because of government intervention and ridiculous speculation taken to the greediest limit imaginable, but all under the purview of the government. And then what ends up happening? The government bails everyone out who got us into this mistake.
Yeah.
So, to the tune of $2 trillion, under a conservative president, fiscally conservative president, quote unquote. And then under a progressive Democrat president, quote unquote. No, but they did the exact same thing. Right. They just did a Keynesian bailout that basically, and Keynesianism is a eugenics philosophy that says that, basically, I mean, I just love how everyone sides with John Maynard Keynes. I mean, if there ever was a, white man totalitarian, I can't think of one more, who basically comes in and says, I mean, he believed in eugenics, for crying out loud. And that's the guy we want to go to for our economic theory. Whatever.
Well,
this is a crazy, hysterical fad for the last 100 years, our economic system.
That's not the guy I want to go to. And
no.
I think more and more people like you and I see it. It's interesting. The way things have gone after the election, there are so many more people that are waking up to the idea that, like, government's not going to always be there to wipe my butt. I'm going to have to start figuring some of this out.
Right.
And it's actually, I'm starting to wake up a little bit and say, like you're saying, about the idea of setting up your own network, learning how to do things, like you said, going back to school to do to figure out the ins and outs of website design and figuring out podcasts, that kind of thing. Like, well, we're becoming a much more do-it-yourself, DIY nation, I think.
Right. And that was the whole thing, with Ender's Game. You think about the old men, they were great tacticians. They were great mentors in terms of military theory, but they weren't so great. They were terrible at cross-cultural communication.
Yes.
And, I think we are at a time where we have to be Ender at the end of that book and in the next book, where it's just rigorously going to the ends of the earth for true understanding, and that's going to require such work, and you can't depend on the government to do it, because the government, their whole game is protection. It's protectionism, and we're in a post-protectionism world. And, I think, a lot of these innovations are going to start changing this, where it's not going to be the government that's going to be able to do it, and you see the amount of trust that's being displayed on the internet, with things like Airbnb and things like that, where people are trusting people they never met. eBay, same thing. I mean, a lot of people said it wouldn't work. You're going to have all these people just ripping each other off. And look at eBay, it works. I mean, look at Uber,
eBay, all these,
and video games. Like, when I started playing League, I was like, this is going to be so toxic. And it is. I mean, it's still very toxic. But just the fact that you can have games where everyone works together, team, not seeing each other's face, have a shared language, and, from talk about cross-cultural. I mean, these video games are so cross-cultural. You can play with people on the other side of the world, and every now and then you are, an Indian, someone from China, someone from America, someone from Malaysia, all working together for something. And actually, like, at the end, like, all right, good job, man. Like, that's something. I mean, so we are, it is a hopeful time. And, I think we just have to kind of do like Ender does, especially towards the end, and think outside the box.
Yeah.
Like, at a very, very different level, not just in a tactical level, but at a communications level. And that's kind of the whole point of the book, is that communication is fundamental. I mean, it's the most important thing.
Someone recently said to me, they read somewhere, the universe aids the journeyman. I don't know if I brought that up before here, but the universe aids the journeyman. And I'm not a big proponent of the whole universe thing, but I do believe that the thrust of, all of our lives heading in, whatever direction it is, if you want to look at the universe as this natural force that's going forward, right? Just because the network of our lives,
right.
It aids the person. It behooves us to look at it, and I think that's what we're doing here. We take a look at some of the pieces that come out of it, some of the reflections, the art reflections from our society, and try to pick it apart and get something out of it.
Right.
I think this has been good conversation. I appreciate your thoughts on this stuff because I've been trying to figure, especially when it comes to net neutrality. And I think what it comes down to for me is I don't think it matters. I think eventually, uh, I think eventually this DIY
Yeah.
sort of thrust of the common man will break through.
Yeah, I agree. And so that's why, I get mad about it, I guess, just because it ends up becoming, it's just like if you have a differing of viewpoint, which is just to me, just it's so odd. Like, in the world of the internet that we're still being forced to make these, all or nothing decisions. And that's just a weird form of totalitarianism. It's like, when a fad happens, everyone has to do it. Oh, you have to help out this NGO because, like, no, don't tell me what to do. Like, just stop it. Like, you don't know me. And
Yeah.
same thing with these bills. It's like everyone has to be on board. You have to stand up for this because we all believe the same thing. No, you're not. You're listening to a comedian, and
Yeah.
a comedian's not a philosopher, and he's not a scientist. And I'm just done being held over the barrel because someone is a good, has good rhetoric.
Yeah. Well, as maneuvers, to bring it back to what we always bring it at the end, what comes to my mind is what do they expect us to do? They expect us to get angry,
Yeah,
and protect our own. And I think we can smile and realize, see the universe and how it's working. See how God is working through in the universe. And when people get upset because we don't believe what they do, we can just smile, nod our heads, and continue doing doing it ourselves.
right. Yeah, and I think that's just one of the hardest things. I think, for a person who's opinionated like me, I want to talk about it.
Yeah.
But, I think ultimately it's just the old adage, actions speak louder than words. And, are we doing our best to try to make the world more connected, not in a consumer sense, but more connected in a communication sense? Like, are we actually understanding each other? And, I think that's where the true value will come, and it will help avoid some of these skirmishes and battles and wars that so many of them have arisen from misunderstanding.
Yeah.
Now there will be battles to fight over things that are worth fighting for. But I think when those things happen, we'll be surprised who's on our side. We'll be like, oh, wow. Yeah. Okay. We all agree on this. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe we will be fighting an invading alien force that honestly wants to eradicate the idea of humanity,
Right.
So, I mean, that has happened before. I mean, humans have made those kind of choices where they just want to eradicate anyone that's not them, and there is no diplomacy. So, but I think we are constantly being pitched to jump to that conclusion before it's true. That everyone's a Nazi, everyone's Hitler, and every situation is the Battle of the Bulge, and we've got to break through. And it's just not the case.
It isn't. And I'm really grateful for our time here. Of course, we've got a little overtime right now, but I think the ability to be able to talk to you, Ford, and talk about these things, I think it's helpful for me. And I think it's I'd like to invite more people into it as we, whether that be questions and answers, or if we actually invite, other people to weigh in on some of these pieces that we talk about.
Sounds good.
All right. Well, I've got to go. And I think the thing we can take forward is what in the world of maneuvering, right? Well, in a world of manipulation, we can be maneuverers and look at look at communication as the
right.
key.
Yeah, try to reduce damage in the manipulations of the world. Try to maneuver through the manipulative games, and then really see if there's something more fundamental. Like, is there a way to get these two sides to communicate and maybe avert a crisis that doesn't need to be? There. Maybe we're on the same side. We don't even realize it. And I think, that's what the book is really kind of getting at.
Yeah. All right. Well, continue to create your own. What was it?
Make your own myth.
Make your own myth. And remember that the enemy base is down.
All right. Sounds good.